For the longest time, I believed my marriage to Charles was rock solid, unbreakable. 12 years together is no small feat. We had common goals, a rhythm to our lives, and traditions we'd built over the years. We didn't need words to understand each other. We shared our joys, our sorrows, and were not only best friends but also lovers. So when he quietly suggested one evening that I meet another man, it felt as if my entire world was falling apart. We were sitting in our favorite cafe, nestled on the corner of the street, where the soft glow of the lamps gave the illusion of a private escape in the midst of the bustling city. Charles always preferred the table by the window, so he could watch the people passing by, while I loved listening to his stories about them. We always ordered coffee with cinnamon and almond syrup, an unchanging ritual of our calm evenings together. But that evening was different. This time, his gaze felt heavier, more intense, like it carried some unspoken intention. He set his cup down slowly and clasped his hands together as if bracing for a serious conversation. "I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while," he said. A rush of anxiety washed over me, and a nagging sense that something wasn't right began to creep in, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. There was something in his tone, something different in the way he spoke. Charles was always easygoing and cheerful, yet now, his eyes held more than just casual conversation. "We've been together for a long time, and you know how much I love you," he continued, taking a deep breath like he was about to jump into cold water. "But I want to suggest something a bit unconventional. I want you to meet another man." His words hit like a bolt of lightning, shattering the peaceful evening around us. I froze, unable to process what I had just heard. My mind felt like it stopped working, and I just stared at him, completely lost for words. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, though I could feel it trembling. Charles smiled faintly, trying to appear composed, but there was fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt gripping my own chest. He met my gaze, his expression almost trying to reassure me. "It's not because something's missing between us. I love you, and I always will. But I think it's time we try something new, something that could bring us closer." My thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion. Why? Why now? I could feel my heart racing in my chest. On one hand, I trusted Charles completely. But on the other, his proposal shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Where had this idea come from? We had always been open and honest with one another, discussing everything. But this was completely new, and it terrified me. "Are you serious?" I asked, searching his face for any hint of hidden meaning that I might be missing. "Absolutely," he replied, looking at me with a mixture of fear and hope. "It doesn't mean we have to act on it right away. I just want you to think about it. I really believe it could change things for the better." We sat there in silence, and I stared at my coffee cup, clutching it as if it could shield me from what he'd just said. The idea of letting something like that happen seemed absurd, but deep down, I couldn't shake off a strange sense of curiosity. What if Charles was right? What if this could actually bring us closer? That thought flickered in my mind, brief as a spark in the dark. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react. But I did know one thing. What I thought was an unshakable world was now beginning to crack. After that night, I couldn't find any peace. Questions spun endlessly in my head. Why now? Why him? What does this really mean? I went back and forth between wanting to dismiss it all and feeling a strange curiosity I'd never experienced before. Charles and I talked more, but every conversation seemed to lead to more questions. He patiently explained that this wasn't about drifting apart or changing, but about exploring something new together, something that might bring us closer. A week later, Charles suggested we attend a private party for couples looking for new experiences. I agreed, not so much out of interest, but out of a need to understand what was going on in my husband's mind. We arrived at a building on the outskirts of town, where soft lighting and smooth jazz greeted us at the door. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy but unusual, with plush sofas, dim lighting, and endless conversations that created a sense of being in a world of its own. We headed to the bar, where Charles ordered a glass of wine for each of us, and then suggested we take a walk. I felt out of place, like a stranger in this unfamiliar setting, but at the same time, I couldn't deny a pull toward the freedom and lightness in the air. Charles held my hand, and I looked into his eyes, searching for the confidence I was lacking. That's when I saw him. Daniel was tall, with a light stubble and a slightly ironic smile. He didn't stand out among the crowd, but there was something in his gaze, calm, confident, and full of interest, like he already knew who I was. We exchanged a few words, nothing significant, but behind each sentence, I felt an underlying tension. "Want to step outside for some fresh air?" he asked, and I found myself nodding, unable to say no. We stepped outside, and the cool night air hit my skin, the silence only broken by the faint sounds of the city. Daniel paused, turned to me, and asked, "Have you ever done something just for yourself, without thinking about what others expect?" His question took me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. After years of marriage and family life, I'd long forgotten what it was like to act without considering the consequences. My mind told me to stop, but before I could say anything, Daniel gently touched my face, and everything else seemed to fade away. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, unhurried kiss, as if testing whether I was ready. The kiss wasn't passionate or forceful. It was calm, gentle, and surprisingly tender, like a wave washing over the shore after a storm. For a moment, I felt free and vulnerable, and all my doubts seemed to melt away. When the kiss ended, Daniel smiled, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We stood there in silence, but inside, emotions stirred that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about him, not really, it was about me. About discovering something inside myself that I'd long ignored. When we went back inside, Charles was waiting, watching us from across the room. I sat down next to him, and he looked at me, almost as if trying to read the answer in my eyes. I felt a strange mixture of joy and guilt, but Charles simply took my hand and smiled softly. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, but words failed me. It was just a kiss, but it changed something inside me. It wasn't about love, passion, or betrayal. It was about freedom. About realizing that sometimes, stepping outside our comfort zone helps us understand who we really are. After that night, something inside me shifted. Charles and I returned home in complete silence, and even our familiar house seemed different. I looked at the same walls, the photographs hanging in the hallway, our bedroom with the bed linens I had carefully picked out, and yet everything felt like it held a new, unfamiliar meaning. Daniel's question lingered in my mind. "Have you ever done something just for yourself?" That question became an obsession, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I realized that for so long, I had been living to meet others' expectations, taking care of Charles, my job, the house, but not taking care of myself. But understanding this only deepened the confusion inside me. It didn't bring clarity. It only made the conflict more intense. I didn't know how to move forward with everything I believed about my life starting to unravel. Charles noticed. We sat in the kitchen, sipping our morning coffee, and the silence between us was almost tangible. He tried to keep the conversation light, but I caught his glances, quick, almost searching, as if he was looking for something in my eyes, too afraid to ask aloud. One night, as we lay in bed, he spoke quietly. "I don't want you to feel obligated or guilty," he said, each word weighted with care. We both turned to our separate sides of the bed, the distance between us thickening. "This shouldn't be a burden. I just want us both to find something new within ourselves, not to destroy what we already have." I didn't respond. I wanted to scream that I didn't understand what was happening to me, that I felt lost, and that I no longer knew where the line between desire and fear lay. But instead, I gripped the blanket tighter and pretended everything was okay. At work, I couldn't focus. I found myself zoning out, unable to hear my colleagues, missing meetings, and losing track of conversations. I stared blankly at my computer screen, but all I could see were flashes of memories. Daniel, his kiss, the quiet conversation with Charles in the car. I wanted to run to the bathroom and let it all out, let myself cry, and release the pressure building inside me. But I couldn't allow myself to be that vulnerable. I couldn't let anyone see how deeply this was consuming me. One evening, Charles suggested we take a few days at our country house. It had always been our peaceful escape, a small home tucked away in the woods, with a view of the lake. I agreed, hoping that a change of scenery would help me find some clarity. We packed up and left the city the next morning, leaving behind all the questions that had been haunting me. I felt a slight weight lift from my shoulders. Charles built a fire, and we sat together under a blanket, just like old times. We talked about everything except what was really weighing on us. He shared stories about his work meetings, and I listened, but my thoughts were elsewhere, drifting like the smoke rising from the fire. On the second day, I woke up early and went down to the lake. The water was dark and still, reflecting the overcast sky. I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I wanted to feel something, anger, relief, joy, anything. But instead, there was only emptiness, like I was adrift, not knowing where to go next. Charles joined me, wrapping his arms around me from behind. We stood there, silent for several minutes. I felt his warmth, but all I could think about was Daniel and the feelings he had stirred inside me. "Are you thinking about him?" Charles asked suddenly, his voice calm, with no hint of accusation or jealousy. Just a quiet understanding. I wanted to lie, to say no, but I couldn't. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not about him. It's about what this means for me." Charles nodded, as if he had expected that answer. We went back to the house, where he made coffee while I sat at the table, listening to the steady drip of the coffee maker. We didn't need words. He knew I was still searching, still lost, and he didn't rush me. Those days in the cabin felt like a break from the storm inside me. I realized that, despite all the doubts, Charles and I had grown even closer. But I also knew that our journey was only just beginning, and we would have to find a way to balance what we were seeking with what we already had. When we returned to the city, I felt a little more settled. The time away had helped me clear my head, but the questions still loomed, hanging heavy in the air. There was a lingering uncertainty and an unexpected guilt toward Charles. Unspoken, but it hovered between us, like an invisible barrier. We started living in what felt like two parallel lives, close, but somehow still distant. Charles understood me better than anyone else. One evening, he suggested that we meet Daniel again. Not because he was pushing me into anything, but because he saw how lost I still was in my own thoughts. He wanted me to find some answers, even if it meant meeting the man who had stirred all this up inside me. Despite my reservations, I agreed. We chose a neutral place, an art gallery. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like the right decision. Art is all about exploration, expression, and feeling, and maybe, just maybe, in that space, I could rediscover something about myself. Daniel was already there when we arrived, waiting at the entrance. His eyes held that same calmness I remembered, but this time I saw more. He had become something more than just a man. I realized he was now a symbol of my own journey, my search for who I was beyond everything else. We greeted each other briefly, and there was no need for more words. Charles stayed a little to the side, giving me the space I needed. Daniel and I wandered through the galleries, observing abstract paintings filled with splashes of color and wild lines. I thought art should have meaning, something clear to explain, but here in these rooms it only raised more questions. Just like my life right now. In one of the rooms, where the walls were covered with massive canvases, Daniel suddenly stopped and turned toward me. There was something different in his eyes, something hard to define. Not just interest, but a deeper desire to understand. He stepped closer, and this time, his movements were more certain, as if he knew exactly what needed to happen. "I think you're holding back a lot," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of yourself." His words hit me like a jolt. I couldn't respond at first. All I could do was nod, because deep down I knew he was right. I was afraid of what I had uncovered about myself, and where it might lead. Daniel closed the distance between us, and this time, the kiss was nothing like before. It wasn't gentle or slow. It was intense, sharp, filled with a passion and emotion I hadn't expected. I felt my hands grip his shoulders as he pulled me closer, as if we were both trying to hold on to something, trying to escape the chaos inside. It was a whirlwind, a moment where everything else faded away. But then, just as suddenly, I pulled back, as if something inside me said enough. I took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. The confidence that had been there before was gone, and I realized that this moment wasn't just important for him. It was for me. In that kiss, I felt both my freedom and my fear. I was terrified of how far I could let myself go, and at the same time, how much I needed to hold back. I stepped away, and Daniel released me without a word, understanding that it wasn't just about us. We were both searching for something within ourselves, but what we found was something bigger, a boundary that didn't need to be crossed. When I returned to Charles, he looked up, and without asking a single question, he understood everything from the look on my face. I sat beside him, and he took my hand, holding it tightly, as if afraid I might slip away again. We stayed there in the gallery, surrounded by vibrant paintings and silent cries of color, and for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with care. "Yes," I replied, and this time, my words were honest. I knew I needed time, but I also knew what I didn't want. Charles nodded, pulling me closer. In that moment, I understood that our journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and the road ahead would still be filled with uncertainty. But we were together. We were still learning. Learning to love, to trust, and most importantly, to be honest with ourselves. After the gallery, Charles and I returned home, but something had shifted. Our apartment, once a simple refuge, now felt like the beginning of something new. Every object in the house, from the old books to the paintings on the walls, now seemed to reflect our shared journey. And while this path wasn't what I had expected, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving in the right direction. Charles remained by my side every step of the way. He didn't ask unnecessary questions or pressure me for answers. He quietly observed my search, never rushing me. But I knew it wasn't easy for him either. We often sat together in silence, sometimes talking about the little things, watching old movies we once loved, rediscovering those small moments of connection. It was a strange, yet comforting feeling, this act of finding each other anew. It was during this time that we met Jessica and William. They, too, were exploring new horizons in their relationship, and they quickly became close friends. Jessica was lively and full of energy, wise beyond her years, with a spark in her eyes that told me she had seen more of the world than its bright side. William, on the other hand, was calm and thoughtful, a perfect balance to her vivacity. Together, they were like the calm and storm of a shared life. We often met at a little cafe, sitting leisurely over cappuccinos, talking about everything and nothing, without the fear of being judged. Jessica and I would share our doubts and dreams, and she always had just the right words to help restore my confidence. She once told me how she and William had faced their own difficult times, wondering if they should keep exploring or return to what they knew. But, she said, her voice steady, those moments always ended with us growing closer, becoming stronger. The most important thing is to be honest with yourself and with each other. We were sitting in the park, basking in the autumn sun, when she said this. You can make mistakes, take steps backward, but as long as you keep talking and don't hide your feelings, everything will be okay. Her words stayed with me. I realized that our journey wasn't just about new experiences or emotions. It was about allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with the people we loved. I told Charles about my lingering fears, about the uncertainties that had been haunting me. He listened without interrupting, simply squeezing my hand a little tighter. Charles and I began spending more time with Jessica and William. We had dinners, played board games, discussed books and movies, but most importantly, we became part of something bigger. We found a community of people who were also trying to navigate their own feelings. Each meeting felt like a small therapy session, a chance to speak freely and feel understood. One evening, we hosted them at our place, but things didn't go as planned. The lasagna burned, and a storm caused the lights to go out. We lit candles, and what could have been a normal dinner turned into something special. We laughed, drank wine, and shared stories from our lives. Jessica told us about how she and William had decided to travel through Europe, leaving their jobs behind to rediscover each other. William smiled quietly, a knowing look in his eyes, as if confirming everything she said. In that moment, I saw something precious between them, an unspoken understanding, a deep acceptance of each other. Sitting beside Charles, I felt my fears slowly fade away. We were surrounded by people who genuinely supported us, who didn't judge our choices. Their support was the kind that gave you strength, the kind that helped you keep going, even when the future was uncertain. After everyone left and the house grew quiet again, Charles and I were cleaning up. He stopped, turned toward me, and without a word, pulled me into a close embrace. We stood there in the dark, the soft glow of the candlelight flickering on the kitchen table. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like, despite all the confusion and strange steps we had taken, we were still together. "Thank you for being here," he whispered, and I knew his words meant so much more than just gratitude. In that moment, I realized that our journey wasn't just about seeking new experiences, it was about returning to ourselves. It was a path we were walking together, even when we didn't always know where it would lead.